Hey everyone, it's Jenny and welcome back to my channel. This story ain't over. So even though it's like freaking hot in Toronto right now and I'm sweating in this sweater, fall is on the horizon. It is September, so you know I had to make my fall TBR. I spent a couple days like thinking really long and hard about what books I wanted to read this fall, and I feel like I split them up into the books that I want to read pre-Halloween and the books that I want to read post-Halloween. Fall is just that season where everything leading up to Halloween is like spooky season, spooky vibes, and then everything after that is just like stay in, cozy up with a cup of tea and a good book type of vibes. So I obviously have a lot of books to get through for this video, so I thought it might be helpful to group them based off of which reading vlog I might want to put them in or like what theme they're based around, just so that we get a better sense. Okay, I'm gonna take off this sweater because I am dying from the heat. Okay, the first set of books are just by authors that I already love and adore. So the first book is Rouge by Mona Awad. You guys might know her as the author of Bunny and also All's Well. I particularly loved All's Well even more than Bunny. I know lots of people love Bunny, but this book seems like it's a little bit similar to All's Well. The description calls it a gothic fairy tale and it involves this like lonely dress shop clerk whose mother dies, and so she is like dealing with that whole situation and ends up stumbling into this path of youth and beauty. She's like obsessed with skincare regimens and that kind of thing. So it's kind of this real world fairy tale that deals with the idea of youth and beauty. I typically love Mona Awad's books. They are always super weird, but they're enjoyable and I feel like they always touch on themes that I'm really interested in. Next up, I have a couple books by Silvia Moreno Garcia, whom I love and adore. So the first one is her newest release, which is Silver Nitrate. This has been called a occult thriller. I know it's set in the 1990s in Mexico City. Every Silvia Moreno Garcia book I've read, I have basically loved, and she always has a way of telling a really compelling and interesting story with characters that are super flawed. I am intrigued by the occult nature of this book, and I feel like I've been putting off reading it because it would just be perfect for spooky season, and I think now is the perfect time. The second of Silvia Moreno Garcia's books that I want to read is She Walks in Shadows. This is actually edited by her and Paula R. Stiles. It's actually a horror anthology, and from what I know, it's by a group of women who are writing in this anthology, and they take on some of the Lovecraftian horrors, and each one tells a different short story. I've had this one on my shelves for a while now, so I definitely want to get to it. Now, with September here, I know I have to read some dark academias because I love dark academias for spooky season, for just this time of year when people are returning to school. I love the fashion, I love the books. If you haven't watched my dark academia video where I read a bunch of popular dark academia books, go watch that. I spent a lot of time on it last fall and I would appreciate the watch. But in terms of dark academias that I want to read this fall, so the first one that I have is actually a dark academia anthology, and it's called In These Hallowed Halls. It's also got this like really freaking beautiful cover. There's a bunch of authors in this anthology, so I'm gonna just flash them up on the screen for you right now. And it would appear that the anthology is just filled with different dark academia stories written by each of these authors. I particularly am excited for the ones by Aldi Blake and ML Rio. They were also featured in that dark academia video that I did, and I loved their books. So I'm excited to see what I'll think of their stories in the anthology. All right, the next dark academia that I want to read is one that has been recommended to me multiple times, and that book is Vita Nostra by Marina and Sergei Dyachenko. This is one that I've heard a lot about, and it's been floated around as like a really great dark academia. I honestly don't know too much about it. I do know that it is translated. It was originally written in Russian, and from what it says on the back, the main character ends up going to this like Institute of Special Technologies, and I believe it involves some sort of like fantasy element to it as well. I'm not sure how dark academia it's gonna be and how more fantasy it's gonna be, but I think overall it's gonna be a little bit on the spooky end, so I'm excited for it. This next one isn't so much dark academia as just a like horror comedy set in a school, so I just sort of grouped it here with these books, and that is Plain Bad Heroines by Emily M. Danforth. From what I know, this book involves two different timelines, one set in 1902 and one in our present day. And on the back there's a blurb that says this is recommended for fans of queer kissing, Victorian romances, ghost stories, and Hollywood hijinks. And I think that is like a culmination of things that I would love to read in one book. So I'm pretty excited for this one. I know I'm grouping this under dark academia, but it really isn't one. But I feel like I'm just grouping it as like an academia book for the fall that has some horror elements. Next up, I have a few books that are like classic horrors, so whether they're written by classic authors or authors from like not our contemporary day. So the first one I have is Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. This one is often talked about as like a classic gothic horror. It was originally published in 1938, I believe, and I have seen the Netflix adaptation, which, although I thought was really bad, I was very intrigued by the story, and I feel like the book would probably be so much better. I've also seen a lot of people online just share quotes from the book that I've just found really stunning, so I think the writing in this one's going to be really beautiful. The next book that I have is Dark Tales by Shirley Jackson. This is actually a collection of short stories by Shirley Jackson. I particularly love Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House, which is like one of my favorite horror novels, like haunted house stories. It was written in the 1950s, and I read it for a fantasy horror class in university and absolutely loved it. So I'm kind of going into this anthology with some high hopes, just because I felt like the atmosphere that Shirley Jackson created in The Haunting of Hill House was just so amazing. So I hope I get a similar vibe from this. And then the final classic horror that I want to pick up is Interview with the Vampire by Anne Rice. This one is often described as like the classic vampire book, and it's also described as pretty like sultry and sexy from what I've heard, but I've also heard that it's got like some problematic things to it, so I'm intrigued. Like, I feel like this is going to be an experience when I do read it, and I'm kind of looking forward to just dissecting it, because I feel like a lot of classics, although they can have issues with them, I think it's interesting to examine that as well. Okay, next up I have a bunch of books that I'm calling real world horror, or books that involve our real world or topics in our real world, but tackle them in some sort of sinister, unsettling, horrific way. So the first one I want to pick up is Natural Beauty by Ling Ling Huang. All I really know about this one is that it follows a young musician who ends up in this like beauty obsessed world, and she ends up getting caught up in this culture of perfection and like doing these procedures to become the most beautiful that you can, and it all just seems like pretty unsettling. So I think it's going to be a fun one, and it'll probably tackle some interesting themes. In the similar vein of like body horror, the next book I have is Lakewood by Megan Giddings. This one is more of a sci-fi from what I've heard, but also a horror, and it involves this young black woman whose grandmother dies suddenly, and like it's revealed that there's a lot of family debt. So she drops out of college and takes this job in this remote town, and there she's participating in this secret research program where they do these different experiments on her body, and essentially it's this real world horror of what's been done to black bodies in the name of science. On a similar note, the next book that I want to read is Her Body and Other Parties by Carmen Maria Machado. This one is a set of short stories that map the realities of women's lives and the violence that is visited upon their bodies. So it's a similar kind of idea of body horror-ish, and it involves some sci-fi fantasy elements to it as well. I was a huge fan of this author's memoir, In the Dream House, and since this one is a National Book Award finalist and I've heard so many people say great things about it, I'm really excited for it. Another book that I want to pick up in this sort of category is Bad Cree by Jessica Johns. This one is a bit of a supernatural horror, and it's by an Indigenous author, and I was really excited for this one because the description of it calls it a haunting, fierce ode to relationships among women and femmes and the strength found in kinship. I like that it's a story of like women, and it involves dreams as well and family, and I feel like it's going to be one of those more heartwarming supernatural thrillers. And then the final real world horror that I want to read is The Weight of Blood by Tiffany D. Jackson. I had asked some of you on Instagram what I should be reading this fall, and a lot of you said this one. I think it's because I've told you guys before that I love Tiffany D. Jackson's books. I've read every single one of them and have loved every one of them. So I feel like this one, her newest horror, is going to be no different. What I know about this one is that it's a bit of a Stephen King's Carrie retelling with like a slasher prom situation. And as always, Tiffany D. Jackson's books just tackle some really interesting themes, so I'm excited for this one. Next up, of course, I need to read a bunch of books with vampires in them, because you can't have Halloween, you can't have spooky season without vampires. So the first vampire book that I want to read is Vampires of El Norte by Isabel Canes. This is a book that I've been hearing so much about online, and so many people have told me that like her books are so atmospheric. From what the description says, it's a supernatural western where vampires face off at the Texas-Mexico border, and honestly that seems like so much fun and like such a interesting vampire read. So I'm definitely really looking forward to this one and excited to check it out. The next vampire book that I want to pick up is A Dowry of Blood by S.T. Gibson. I've heard everybody and their mom talk about this book on TikTok, so I knew I had to read it. I have both the self-published version of this book and the traditionally published version, but I'll probably be reading the traditionally published unpublished version. Essentially what I know about this one is that it involves Dracula's brides and follows particularly one of them, and I am so excited for that whole concept. I think it's going to be really interesting, and I also like that it's set in the time period of Dracula, so it's very much got that gothic vibe and like period vibes, and I believe it also has a bit of a romance, which should be interesting. The next vampire book that I need to read is Masters of Death by Olivia Blake. All I know about this book is that it's by Olivia Blake and it involves vampires, and that was honestly all I needed to know. I absolutely loved the Atlas 6 by Olivia Blake, and I know a lot of people are just going crazy over the rest of her books, so I knew I needed to pick this one up for fall. The next vampire book that I want to read is House of Hunger by Alexis Henderson. I've heard really great things about this author's other book, which is called A Year of the Witching. I personally couldn't get into that book, but when I heard about this one, which involves vampires and more of a like historical setting, I was super hyped. This one is essentially a very gothic tale, and it involves a sapphic romance, which I'm super excited for. The final vampire book that I want to pick up is not actually a vampire book, but it has the same principle as vampires, and that is The Book Eaters by Sunny Dean. This is a book that I bought last year during spooky season and never got around to, and I heard a lot of people talking about it at the time. Essentially what I know about this book is that it's set in the Yorkshire moors, and it follows a secret line of people for whom books are food. So they can literally consume the stories that are in a book and like have it transferred to their brain, I think. But what I found interesting about the plot of this book is that it actually follows one woman in the secret line of people whose son actually has a craving not for books, but for human minds. So I feel like it gets into the territory of vampirism with like the consuming of someone else, and I think it's going to be really interesting, so I'm excited to check this one out. And of course, I can't do spooky season without some haunted house books, so the first book that I want to pick up is A House with Good Bones by T. Kingfisher. I've previously read What Moves the Dead by T. Kingfisher. I read it last fall and really enjoyed it. It was like a very short novella and also had a bit of a haunted house element to it, but it was super atmospheric, and I think that's what I love the most about it. So I'm hoping that this book will be very similar. All I really know about this one is that it's a Southern Gothic, so it's got that element to it. I don't particularly want to know more about this one before reading it, so I think I'm just gonna leave it at that. The next haunted house book that I want to pick up is She Is a Haunting. This one, from what I've heard, is a Gothic haunted house story, and particularly it involves this French colonial home in Vietnam. So essentially our main character is going to Vietnam to visit her estranged father and is trying to just pretend like, you know, her family is a happy family in their French colonial home that her father is restoring. I'm really excited for this one because I love haunted house stories with like big families involved, and I also think this is going to touch on some really great themes of colonialism, so I'm excited. And then the next haunted house book that I want to pick up is The Hacienda by Isabel Canes. I mentioned Isabel Canes' most recent book, Vampires of El Norte, earlier, so this one is her debut novel, and from what I know, this one has been pitched as Mexican Gothic meets Rebecca, so like very much that Gothic horror vibe, haunted house vibe, and it's set in the aftermath of the Mexican War of Independence. It's set in this remote house and involves some sort of haunting, and I think it's going to be just so atmospheric and spooky, so I cannot wait. And then the final haunted house book that I have is Just Like Home by Sarah Gailey. This one is a little bit more on like the Gothic thriller side of things and involves a main character who's returning to her family home. This one in particular involves murder, so I think it should be quite interesting, and I've heard really great things about this author. All right, and then the next like category of books that I have for my pre-Halloween TBR is the deathly retellings, I guess you would call them. So the first book that I want to read is A Haunting on the Hill by Elizabeth Hand, and this one, as you can probably tell from the title, is a retelling of The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson. As I mentioned earlier, The Haunting of Hill House is one of my favorite horrors, so I'm really excited to see how this retelling tackles the story. It's obviously going to be set in our present day, but one of the things that I'm really excited about is that the original story has a lot of like queer undertones to it, maybe overtones even, and so I feel like it'll be a little bit more obvious in this retelling, which should be a lot of fun. The next deathly retelling that I'm excited for is The Death I Gave Him by M.X. Liu. I'm super excited for this one because it's actually a retelling of Hamlet by Shakespeare, and Hamlet is probably my favorite Shakespeare play ever. I absolutely love the like deathly themes to it, and I'm so excited for this book because it's more of a 21st century version of the story, and it involves some sci-fi fantasy elements to it as well and military aspects. I don't want to know too much more and spoil myself, so I'm going into it very blind. And then the final deathly retelling is yet another Shakespeare retelling, and that is One for My Enemy by Olivia Blake. This one is a retelling of Romeo and Juliet, and it's set in New York City, and it involves rival witch families, which has me so hyped. Like, the idea of witches and rival families, so exciting. And I think it's gonna be really amazing just because I love the way that Olivia Blake writes her characters, so cannot wait for this one. Okay, so after that many books, you're probably thinking, yeah, she must be done. No, I still have a bunch of books that I want to read after Halloween, which get into more of this like cozy vibe. So of course, first up, I have some cozy fantasies that I want to read after Halloween. And the first one is one that I've heard so much about, and that is Legends and Lattes by Travis Baldree. I bought this one last fall and really meant to get around to it, but never did. So I'm really excited to pick it up this fall. It has been described as a high fantasy with low stakes, and I've always wanted to read a fantasy like that. I think it's going to be really cute and adorable. And it basically involves this like battle-weary orc who decides to open a coffee shop in this like fantasy world. And just that concept is just so adorable. So I can't wait to read this one. The next book is also a very cozy fantasy from what I've heard, and that is The Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches by Sangu Mandana. I've actually started this one before, but like put it down at the time because I wasn't in the mood for it. So I'm definitely hoping to pick this one up during like a cozier time this fall. It involves this main character who is a witch who has like kept her identity a secret for most of her life, getting invited to this like remote place to help teach these like young witches, and she ends up like falling in love, and it just seems super cute and like a really lighthearted fantasy, so I'm excited for it. Speaking of witches, the next cozy fantasy that I want to pick up is Venco by Sherry Dimeline. I've read The Marrow Thieves by this author and it was absolutely incredible, but I'm really intrigued by this book because it seems like more of a lighthearted cozy fantasy. It involves the main character who's this orphaned girl, and she ends up stumbling upon some of her mother's old things and discovers this whole network of witches who she starts to find a home with. This one is written by an Indigenous author, and I feel like it's going to be both really cozy but also really creepy and a little bit thrilling, but more on the overall cozy side, so I'm excited for it. The last cozy fantasy that I want to read is one that I've seen a lot around like Book Talk and Bookstagram, and that is Emily Wilde's Encyclopaedia of Faeries. And from what I know, this book follows a curmudgeonly professor, who I'm assuming is Emily Wilde, who travels to this like remote small town in the north and is going to study fairies and like basically write this encyclopedia, I think, and she ends up like discovering this whole community of fairies and whatever else. It feels like it's going to be a really cozy fantasy and has been described as heartwarming in a lot of the blurbs, so I'm really excited for it. And then of course, besides some cozy fantasies, I also have some just like hardcore fantasies that I want to read this fall. So the first is Nettle and Bone by T. Kingfisher. I bought this book a while ago and have been meaning to pick it up. So this is one of their fantasies, and it's more of like a fairy tale book, but not one where the princess marries the prince, but one where she kills him, or at least that's what the blurb says. It's been described as like a darkly funny feminist fairy tale, so I'm intrigued. It's also really short, so I think I can just like knock it out this fall. The next fantasy is one that I've been meaning to read for years now and haven't gotten around to, and that is Gods of Jade and Shadow by Silvia Moreno Garcia. I absolutely love Silvia Moreno Garcia, but this is the one book of hers that I've never gotten around to reading, and this one in particular has been described as like a dazzling fairy tale rooted in Mexican mythology. And what I find interesting is that it's actually set in 1920s Mexico and it involves like the Jazz Age, so I think it's gonna be really great. I just for some reason haven't gotten around to reading it. Next, I have a couple of fantasies that I've heard really great things about, and they're both by the same author. So the first book is The Wolf and the Woodsman by Ava Reed. This involves Hungarian history and Jewish folklore, which I find super exciting. I've never read a book with those kind of backgrounds, and I honestly don't know too much about this one, but it just seems like an old school fantasy with like a knight and a king and like a princess and that kind of thing. Now, Ava Reed's next book is one that I'm super excited for because I feel like it's even more up my alley, and that is Juniper and Thorn. I've had this book recommended to me by so many different people, and it's been described as more of a like gothic fantasy. Particularly, it's a gothic horror retelling of the juniper tree. I don't know that story, but it's a retelling of that. And the back says it is a story in which a young witch seeks to discover her identity and escape the domination of her ruthless wizard father. Perfect for fans of Shirley Jackson and Catherine M. Valente. The fact that it's compared to Shirley Jackson has me super hyped, so I think this one's gonna be really fun, and also a bit on the spooky side, which I will never say no to, even though I'm gonna be picking this one up after Halloween. Speaking of a little bit of a spooky vibe, the next fantasy I want to read also has a bit of a spooky element to it, and that is The Bone Orchard by Sarah A. Mueller. This one, as you can tell, seems a little bit on the spookier side, involves a lot of death. From what I've read in the description of this book, it basically involves this woman who is like the head of the orchard house, which is like this home for the emperor's concubines. But one day, instead of coming to see our main character Charm, he actually summons her to the palace and gives her his dying decree. So he's in the middle of dying, I guess, and he decides to tell her that she is the one who has to choose which of his sons is going to inherit the throne, and he wants her to choose based off of her figuring out who is responsible for the emperor's death. And if she does this, she'll be released from her life of bondage and serving the kingdom. And although this has a bit of a convoluted premise, I feel like it's going to be really fun and a bit of a spooky fantasy because it's got this like thriller element of trying to figure out who the killer is. And then the final fantasy that I want to pick up this fall is The Adventures of Amina El-Sarafi by Shannon Chakraborty. This is the author of the City of Brass series, which I have tried to read before, but I couldn't really get into. I feel like it was a little bit too dense for me, but I have heard really great things about this book, which involves a female pirate who's trying to like make her own legend and like do her own thing, and I feel like it's just gonna be a lot of fun. Aside from the whole pirate element to it, it's also got a lot of like supernatural fantasy elements to it, and I feel like it's just gonna be really fresh because it's a new take on this like really classic pirate adventure story. Alrighty, then the final few books that I want to read this fall are just ones that are like more literary fictions slash like genre bending books that I didn't really know where to categorize in this video, so I've just left them to the end. The first book is My Dark Vanessa by Kate Elizabeth Russell. This book explores the psychological dynamics of this young teenage girl who is sort of in this relationship with her manipulative teacher, and it basically follows the main character many years later as she's like trying to remember what happened all those years ago and sort of looking back on what happened. And I've heard so many people call this a really powerful book, and I've had it on my shelves for ages, so I can't wait to pick it up this fall. And then the last three books that I have on this ridiculously long list of books that I want to read this fall are all by the same author, and that is Emily St. John Mandel. I have heard so many great things about this author and her books. So I have Station 11, The Glass Hotel, and Sea of Tranquility. All of these I've heard have a bit of a genre bending element, like they're both literary but also have some speculative elements to them. I'm not really sure. I feel like I just have so much mystery surrounding these books, and I just really want to know what the hype is about with this author, so I just really want to read them this fall. Okay, and with that said, those are the like 40 plus books that I want to read this fall, both pre-Halloween and post-Halloween, and all of the spooky and cozy vibes in between. I feel like this is one of my most ambitious TBRs, but it's also one of my most structured TBRs, and hopefully this gives you an insight into the videos that are coming up soon from me and just what I am feeling this fall. But I would love to hear from all of you if you have read any of these books and what you thought of them, or if you have any book recommendations for me for the fall, definitely leave them down below. I feel like there's so many great books on this list, and a lot of these are from my physical TBR as well, so I'm excited to just knock them out of the park. As always, thank you guys so much for watching. Definitely go check out my Instagram and TikTok in the description down below if you want to get more regular updates on what I'm doing and what I'm reading, and I will see you guys in my next video, so please remember that this story ain't over. Bye!